April 23, 1917. A gargantuan Zeppelin launches from Tonner, Denmark. Bearing the Iron Cross, the German airship L-23 had seen plenty of action by this point in the war, having struck England 3 times in bombing raids. L-23's mission today would be different, however, for she was to patrol the North Sea, interdict any Allied shipping, and send it to the bottom. Commander Ludwig Brockholt would go after shipping lanes, yes, but today, he wasn't just going to sink his enemy. Today, we're stepping aboard Zeppelin L-23 as it seizes Norwegian ship Royal. Oxford Dictionary defines piracy as the practice of attacking and robbing ships at sea. Almost as far back as sailing ships first slid into the water, lowly criminals and adversary warships roamed the seas of antiquity for prey. Typically, merchant vessels transporting supplies and even riches were choice targets for pirates. The golden age of piracy from the mid-1600s to the early 18th century saw pirate activity across the globe as international trade was becoming a reality. This is where you see the romanticized sailing ships broadsiding one another with dashing men boarding and scrapping it out. Of course, it was never quite that glamorous. Now, this era is a little outside of my wheelhouse, but I definitely recommend checking out the YouTube channel Walk the Plank for more information. He does an excellent job explaining the truths of pirate life back in the day via high-quality videos, and I definitely think he's worth a watch. On that note, there were also government-backed pirates known as privateers, who were tasked with capturing merchant vessels of hostile nations. As such, they had to abide by certain rules of the sea and couldn't go after their own ships. A privateer could be a private citizen given permission from their own government to claim prizes, but prizes could also be claimed by proper naval vessels, and the payout distributed amongst the crew. In order to properly capture a vessel by prize rules, most nations decreed that unarmed merchant vessels were to not be fired upon unless they did not stop when prompted. If the ship were to either be captured or destroyed by the privateer, they were responsible for proper treatment of the crew, either allowing them to disembark via lifeboat if close to shore, or even just letting them off in a port. By the late 19th century, most nations had abolished legalized privateering, decreeing that naval captains and crews would no longer be paid out prize money. That being said, the basic concept of prize rules would evolve into cruiser rules, which, though the naval crews were not to receive any personal cash-outs, they would still be responsible for the freighter crew's safety. As World War I started in 1914, cruiser rules were still recognized by the Allied and Central Powers. A naval vessel could not engage an unarmed merchant ship of another nation unless the crew had disembarked or were taken aboard the attacking vessel. This would change as the war developed and submarines got into the mix, but generally speaking, by 1917, cruiser rules were still followed to an extent, and not just by surface ships. While the idea of an airship being a frontline weapon is absurd to us in the 2020s, they were a very common sight in the 1910s. Most navies of the world had rigid airships, including Great Britain and, yes, of course, the German Empire. Now, these things weren't what we call blimps now. Zeppelins have a rigid metal frame that suspends hydrogen bags within them. On the contrary, blimps are essentially airbags that keep their shape via air pressure. For a long time, going back to the 1890s, Zeppelins were seen as the most efficient method of air travel before the airplane was invented. Zeppelins were initially used to transport mail and passengers over land and sea alike. It didn't take long until military applications were conceptualized for these massive air-going ships. Now, these things weren't like the old observation balloons of old for spotting artillery. These could be maneuvered and fly over pretty much any territory unimpeded. Airships were also big enough to carry early radio sets, allowing better communication with the ground. Eventually, turret and machine guns were fitted to Zeppelins purchased by the German Army and Navy. The first Navy Zeppelin, L-1, entered service in October 1912. Zeppelin production increased as the war broke out in Europe. The Germans carried out some of the first strategic bombing missions in history with Zeppelins when London was bombed throughout 1915 and 1916. Air defenses of the time were not suited for intercepting a Zeppelin, until higher velocity AA artillery and higher flying planes like the Sopwith Pup came onto the scene. In response, the Q-class Zeppelin was introduced, a lengthened version of the older P-class with an additional gas bag held within. The additional hydrogen allowed the Q-class to cruise to 12,000 feet with a 2-ton bomb load. The 23rd German Navy Zeppelin, originally designated LZ-66 by the Zeppelin Corporation, was dubbed L-23 and introduced on April 8, 1916. L-23 was armed with no less than 8 MG-08 machine guns and could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs at a slick 50 knots. That might be slow by today's standards, but back then when most surface ships could barely make 30 knots and planes were topping out at just over 100, 50 is not a bad clip. Another benefit to airships is that they can stop in midair and hover. Keep that in mind, that'll be important soon. L-23 was involved in 3 air raids over England from 1916 to 1917, but her crowning moment would occur over the North Sea in April. In charge of the Zeppelin was Commander Ludwig Bockholt. Bockholt had been in the German Navy since 1903, primarily serving on surface ships until transferring to airships in 1916. Taking command of L-23 in March 1917, Bockholt had already experienced the inherent challenges that came with captaining an airship. He had already lost one airship, L-57, as it prepared to deliver supplies to beleaguered German forces in Africa. Now this loss wasn't combat related, as heavy wind gusts in Jüterbog, Germany practically threw L-57 in the midst of trying to get the thing back in a hangar. As it was tossed in the wind, a fire sparked and the vessel, along with all the cargo destined for Africa, was lost. Even so, Bockholt wasn't deterred from his duty and was reassigned to L-23. On April 23, 1917, Bockholt took L-23 north of Horns Rift, Denmark. What he and his crew found was a lone sailing vessel flying the Norwegian flag. Norway was neutral in the Great War, but that doesn't mean they weren't making money on it. Royal was a 3-masted bark built in 1881. At this point in history, steam-powered had revolutionized trade, but it wasn't uncommon to come across conventional sail-driven vessels still. Vessels like Royal were commonly used to ferry supplies to either side of the war by neutral parties, and by 1917, the majority of Scandinavian nations were starting to send more supplies to the Allies versus the Central Powers. Knowing this, Bockholt circled the merchant vessel. So the cruiser rules still applied to airships just as they did surface vessels. With that knowledge, it didn't prevent warning shots from being fired in an attempt to stop the merchant ship. Lacking naval cannons, L-23 still had a 2-ton bomb load, and it released a few across Royal's bow. The ensuing explosion stopped the Norwegian crew in their tracks. L-23 lowered its altitude as it found Royal carried no weapons, only to find a rowboat coming to meet the Zeppelin, which slowly hovered down to wave height in a silent descent. The Norwegian crewmen who surrendered to Bockholt bore a manifest revealing lumber bound for Britain. Royal was supplying the enemy and thus was a valid target. This put Bockholt in a very interesting position. Royal was being surrendered, and it's all been under fair game by this point, but it wasn't as simple as just sinking the bark, as cruiser rules required the crew to be cared for. Now, L-23 did not have the means to take prisoners, and it just did not have the room for them, but another idea was posed by the commander. Regardless of serving aboard a Zeppelin, L-23's crew was made up entirely of sailors who had gone through the same basic naval training that seagoing guys had. As this was the early 20th century, their training included instructions on operating a rigged vessel. 3 of L-23's crew were put aboard Royal to guide her to the German naval pickets nearby. The 19th century sailing vessel was taken as a prize for the German Empire, with Zeppelin L-23 casting her ominous shadow across her rigging as she was turned over to the surface fleet. For the first and only time in history, an airship had successfully captured a merchant vessel. While the Zeppelin's crew weren't awarded a prize payout as far as my research has found, the German government sold Royal to a German petroleum company called, Deutschen Petroleumwirtschaftsges. Leave a comment criticizing my German pronunciation. The act of air privateering was a huge morale booster in the German Navy, but an order was put in place to prevent the act from being repeated. It makes sense, honestly. While Bockholt's actions were unprecedented, it also required him to practically dip his Zeppelin into the frigid water of the North Sea. And that's in pissing distance of a neutral vessel, which really wasn't hauling anything that valuable. German high command feared overzealous Zeppelin commanders might try to repeat the stunt and get their asses shot off by a Q ship or something, so Bockholt was let off with a pat on the back, and since then, no naval vessel has been captured by an airship. But what happened to L-23, Bockholt, and Royal? Royal would go on serving the post-war German merchant fleet into the 1920s, acting as a transport vessel for various companies before being broken up in 1925 or so. Bockholt would be transferred to LZ-104, also known as L-59 for the Navy. On April 7, 1918, almost a year since the taking of Royal, L-59 was seen exploding in midair in transit to strike targets at Malta by a German submarine. None of the Zeppelin's 21 crewmen survived the accident, including Bockholt. L-23 itself wouldn't survive World War I either. In August of 17, a Royal Navy squadron returning from a mine-laying mission spotted L-23 patrolling at low altitude. HMS Yarmouth, a town-class cruiser in the formation, featured a rudimentary catapult system atop one of her gun turrets. The makeshift aircraft carrier launched a lone Sopwith pup flown by Royal Naval Aviator Bernard Smart, who climbed after the fleeing Zeppelin. Building a 3,000-foot advantage on the massive airship, Smart dove his little pup on the behemoth. The Sopwith Pup was the precursor to the later and more powerful Camel. While the Camel is often cited as being an unstable platform for new pilots, the Pup was easier to handle and its light weight allowed it to operate from warship catapults. That being said, the Pup only had one Vickers machine gun mounted forward in front of the pilot. It's incredible to think that a single machine gun could whack a Zeppelin, but Smart had a full load of incendiary ammunition in his belt. At this point in the war, incendiary ammunition made short work of Zeppelins, given their gas bags were full of flammable hydrogen, and Smart lit the thing up. The small Navy fighter ran its gun across the aft end of L-23, igniting volatile fuel and turning it into a falling fireball. Smart would end up ditching his pup alongside the Royal Navy squadron as no means of landing were available in the pre-flat top days. He'd be rescued and be awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his actions against the Zeppelin. As L-59 claimed the entirety of its crew, L-23 did the same. Even a lone gunner, Johann Schuttrup, who bailed out from the falling behemoth, met his fate in the icy North waters, his body being found in September of that year. Pirates are still an occasional occurrence around the world in places like East Africa, but L-23's taking of Royal has never been repeated. Zeppelins would fall out of favor as aircraft evolved, with the final nail in rigid airships being the destruction of Hindenburg in 1937. You'll see the occasional blimp out and about, but the classic Art Deco days of the early 20th century are long gone. Now, I know a certain reformer is a vocal advocate for airships, though, and there is talk of bringing back airships for various duties, but they're not going to be doing much bombing. Well, never say never, I guess. If it turns out a Goodyear blimp drops bombs in a future war, I will deep fry and eat my sunglasses. I mean, hell, we're seeing the return of prop jobs with rear gunners that take out drones in Ukraine, so, well, I guess we'll leave it at that. Once again, I want to thank my patrons, especially my Ace of Aces tier. Special shoutouts go to Shockwave, FB, Weefy, Chris Quinn, Deuce, Private Petey, Pecops, Shuck45, Jake Fuentes, Tico, The Administrator, and Iron. I've said it before and I'll say it again, it really is because of your support that I keep getting to do this stuff, and it really is appreciated. As always, keep that sun in your back, gang. Have a good one.